LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to the January 19th edition of LiberalViewer Sunday Live Clip Roundup. Thanks for joining me. Give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you like what I'm doing here tonight. I picked out the weekend's 10 best, most interesting clips from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the Big Five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, the so-called corporate media here in the United States, for what should be a really educational, fair use media criticism and political commentary show for you all tonight. If you want to follow along on my, here's my clip list. Dropped it on the floor. This is my notes of my 10 clips. So in one still image from Federalist 65 I'll be showing you coming up. If you want to follow along, there's a link down in the video description. There's also a link to the source of all my clips, the sources of all my clips, including the full Bill Maher monologue. I'm going to start with political comedy from Bill Maher in just a minute about the impeachment trial. The impeachment trial of Donald Trump that's starting this Tuesday is my topic. Questions still remain about whether this Senate trial is going to have witnesses and documents like every other trial anyone's ever heard of. And so far, Trump has refused to allow basically any documents or witnesses with this bogus absolute immunity claim that is one of the two articles of impeachment is for obstruction of Congress. And that's not just for executive privilege. That's for this absolute immunity claim that has no basis in law. And there's abuse of power. I'll have a extensive Alan Dershowitz clip later where he says abuse of power isn't even an impeachable offense, which also, if you have read your Constitution and your, here's my Constitution by the way, and your Federalist Papers, Federalist 65, there's a link to Federalist 65 down in the video description by the way, and I'll be talking about that later. Abuse of power is the quintessential impeachable offense. So I will be refuting Dershowitz there. I'll have, like I said, Bill Maher starting off. And if you haven't been paying attention since like last August to the news, the reason Trump was impeached is because he held up military aid in an Oval Office meeting and all sorts of other signs of support for the new Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskiy. And exchange for trying to get him to announce investigations of Joe Biden and Hunter Biden and to look into this bogus conspiracy theory that it was actually Ukrainians somehow influencing this American company Crowdstrike who hacked the DNC server in 2016, not the Russians, which is really Russian disinformation. Anyway, that's why Trump was impeached, if you haven't been following along. And the Senate trial is this week. And like I said, I'm going to start with Bill Maher, back from vacation this week, getting a big cheer from his audience just by mentioning the impeachment trial in his monologue, then pointing out the absurdity of a trial without witnesses, and making a couple other jokes I'll talk about after we watch that clip together over here.
This impeachment trial is happening. The Republicans, of course, are desperately trying to keep any witnesses from testifying, as you do when you're completely innocent. Mitch McConnell says, "We will leave no stone turned." But it's, and we know he's going to get acquitted. I mean, trial, please. We shouldn't even use the word. It's a few minutes of rote formularities followed by Trump getting off. Or as Melania calls it, sex. And this just was the most amazing thing today. Trump announced some of the people on his dream team of lawyers. Did you see this? Ken Starr. Yes, that Ken Starr. The guy for whom the blowjob was too much. He's defending this impeachment guy, and also Alan Dershowitz, who has defended Weinstein, OJ, and now Trump. Wow. Think about that. Trump, Weinstein, and OJ. Flabby, grabby, and stabby. I'm kidding, ladies and gentlemen. Sometimes you go for the low. You don't care.
Some of those jokes were a little risque, which I only mentioned because later in the program, Bill Maher had Nancy Pelosi on and said that his monologue wasn't that risque. But then he ended up with that flabby, grabby, or flabby, stabby, and no, flabby, grabby, and stabby. Flabby. Wait, I have it in my notes. It was flabby, grabby, and stabby. Which I guess is Trump, Weinstein, and OJ. And it actually, that reminds me of an old, like, Johnny Carson joke that's the kind of, that shows my age, I guess. He used to do this thing with Karnak where he'd, like, give the punchline as something that was inside an envelope that had been sealed in a mayonnaise jar or whatever, his whole thing, and he'd hold it up in his head and he'd say, flabby, grabby, and stabby, and then he'd open up the envelope and it would be like, what do you call Alan Dershowitz's clients? Donald Trump, Harvey Weinstein, and O.J. Simpson. So it would be like the punchline and then the joke is... Anyway, that kind of reminded me of that kind of joke there. But you can let me know what you think down in the comment section. Now, the one thing that Bill Maher did there that I don't agree with is attacking Alan Dershowitz or any defense lawyer for who they have defended in the past. If you read your Constitution, Bill of Rights, Sixth Amendment, everyone has the right to an attorney, and that means attorneys have to defend everyone, no matter how heinous they may be. I spent several years as a criminal defense attorney, and I defended people who I didn't like because, of course, when I was a criminal defense attorney, I was a public defender, so I had to take all the clients who couldn't afford an attorney. They were just assigned to me. It's a little bit different when you're doing it for money and getting to choose your clients like Dershowitz did in certain cases, but I still wouldn't criticize him for the clients he took. And I even saw some liberal pundits making that point, which I happen to agree with it. But I will criticize Dershowitz a little later, but I want to get to the news summaries. I have 4 news summaries: NBC, ABC, CNN, and Fox News summaries. The longest and best one, of course, as usual, comes from Meet the Press, where Chuck Todd starts with a live introduction juxtaposing the 18th and 19th century solemnity of the processions in Congress having to do with impeachment, but the real 21st century partisan divide, which actually forgets how partisan things were in the 18th and 19th centuries. But then you'll see, like I said, one of the most extensive news summaries, or the most extensive one. It's almost 4 minutes long from NBC News Meet the Press, talking about the case that the Democrats made. I have their trial memorandum and another link down in the video description if you want to read the Democrats' trial memorandum. I didn't have time to put the 6-page Trump rant in response, which is more things you've read in his tweets anyway. It's not like a real legal response, but I'll talk about all of that a little more after we watch the 4-minute news summary with Chuck Todd on Meet the Press this morning over here.
Good morning, everyone. Last week, we witnessed the dignified and solemn rituals that played out on Capitol Hill with terms like hear ye, do impartial justice, and on pain of imprisonment marking the occasion. But beneath the 18th century rules and 19th century pageantry was corrosive 21st century partisan politics. Republicans accuse Democrats of doing anything they can to remove a president they despise. Democrats accuse Republicans of defending the president no matter how clear the evidence against him. Democratic trial managers and the president's legal team released filings last night outlining their arguments. A source working with the president's impeachment team says they will argue the articles of impeachment allege no violation of law, that impeachment is the result of what they believe is a flawed process in the House, and they insist that the Democrats' case collapses on the actual facts. We will take it head on, this source claims. Still, we're left to wonder about another jury, similarly divided between supporters and opponents of Mr. Trump. That's the one watching at home. That jury remains as divided as the Senate. And the question is, are they still open to being persuaded one way or the other?
A lot of presidents, some good, some not so good. But you got a good one now, even though they're trying to impeach the son of a bitch. Can you believe that?
Late on Saturday, House Democrats formally outlined their case for the president's removal from office, arguing he used his official powers to pressure a foreign government to interfere in a U.S. election for his personal political gain, and then attempted to cover up his scheme by obstructing Congress's investigation into his misconduct.
President Trump put his own personal interests above the national interests, above our national security, and if not stopped, he will do it again.
The president's lawyers issued a 6-page letter calling impeachment a brazen and unlawful attempt to overturn the results of the 2016 election and arguing the president broke no laws. Also this weekend, new documents from Lev Parnas, the Giuliani associate who is facing federal campaign finance charges. They include WhatsApp messages showing Parnas was working with an aide to the top Republican on the House Intelligence Committee, Devin Nunes, to set up calls with Ukrainian prosecutors to feed Rudy Giuliani information about Joe Biden. The messages also show the possible surveillance of Marie Yovanovitch, the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine.
President Trump knew exactly what was going on. He was aware of all of my movements. I wouldn't do anything without the consent of Rudy Giuliani or the president.
I don't know him. I don't know Parnas, other than I guess I had pictures taken, which I do with thousands of people.
As the Senate trial begins,
you will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws, so help you God.
many senators have already signaled how they will vote.
I'm not an impartial juror.
The facts are that he committed an impeachable act, and I will vote to convict him.
The showdown over whether to call witnesses, including former National Security Advisor John Bolton, is likely at least a week away. Democrats will need at least 4 Republican votes.
If I determine that I do not have enough, I will vote to accept additional information by way of additional witness.
I think that if they wanted witnesses, they should have called them in the House.
Right. On Friday, the president unveiled additions to his legal team, including Harvard constitutional lawyer Alan Dershowitz.
Abuse of power, even if proved, is not an impeachable offense.
And former independent counsel Ken Starr, who once argued the case against Bill Clinton. Collectively, the president's defense team has made over 350 appearances on Fox News in the last year.
And joining me now is the number 2 Democrat in the United States Senate. It's Dick Durbin of Illinois. Senator Durbin, welcome back to Meet the Press.
And I will have a Dick Durbin clip coming up. If you're following along, that will be clip 7 on my clip list. There's a link down to the clip list in the video description. But one thing I want to say about that news summary, there's a lot of good stuff there. The 350 hours of appearances on Fox News from Trump's legal team shows how he's picking, a lot of the people there are picked for being legal. And by the way, if you read this book over here, The Loudest Voice in the Room by Gabriel Sherman, you know that Fox News, well, I mean, if you watched my 200 plus Fox News bias videos, you know that Fox News isn't really a news organization. It's an arm of the Republican Party, which makes it pretty easy to understand why Trump's legal team would have so many appearances on Fox News. Also, the Chuck Todd NBC News Meet the Press news summary was the only one to mention the breaking Lev Parnas news. I don't know if that's because it broke mainly on MSNBC with Rachel Maddow this week. That was some pretty devastating additional evidence against the president, and it seems like every week there's 1, 2, multiple new breaking stories in just the Ukraine scandal and how extensive it was, how it goes back to the previous pre-Zelensky administration, how it just gets worse and worse. And if you read my topic description for the last few weeks down in the video description, when I talk about the reason for impeachment, afterwards I say that this actually could be a trap for Republicans to go without witnesses and documents, to rush through impeachment, and you'll see Lindsey Graham talking about the rush through impeachment in the last clip I'm going to show you. If they rush through impeachment and exonerate President Trump, and more facts come out afterwards, that makes things look really bad for the senators who voted that way, and could not only mean that Republicans lose the presidency with Donald Trump being not removed, but stained by his improper conduct in this whole Ukraine scandal. But then all of those senators who voted to cover it up, to whitewash the whole thing without witnesses and documents, they're also going to be in trouble. So you could have a Democratic takeover of the Senate based on that. That's the trap that perhaps, if the facts come out a certain way, the Democrats may have laid for Republicans. So I just wanted to point that out. And Lev Parnas and his breaking news this week, and then the GAO report coming out and saying that Trump violated the law by holding up the aid, and the previous quid pro quo for firing the ambassador Marie Yovanovitch in order to get this Ukrainian prosecutor from the Poroshenko administration. What's his name? Loroshenko? Sometimes I can't remember all the Ukrainian names, but there are just all these extra facts coming out. And so kudos to NBC News, Meet the Press for covering a lot of, or some of that anyway. The ABC This Week with George Stephanopoulos news summary is much shorter. It's only about a minute long. And it's about the same as the CNN State of the Union one I'm going to show you. I don't really understand why it is that they focus on how they all swore an oath together, and that's the last time we're going to hear them all say anything together. But that's the take that George Stephanopoulos came up with in his 1-minute news summary over here.
Good morning and welcome to This Week. The impeachment trial of President Trump started this week with a striking portrait of solidarity in the Senate.
Do you solemnly swear that in all things appertaining to the trial of the impeachment of Donald John Trump, President of the United States, now pending, you will do impartial justice according to the Constitution and laws, so help you God?
It is almost certainly the last moment in this trial where Republicans and Democrats will speak as one. And in the first briefs filed overnight, the battle lines are stark. President Trump's lawyers calling impeachment a, quote, brazen and unlawful attempt to overturn the 2016 election, adding several times the president did nothing wrong. The House brief concludes, President Trump's conduct is the framers' worst nightmare. All ahead of the first full trial day on Tuesday, likely to be an extended skirmish over the rules of engagement. This morning, we hear from all sides, prosecution, defense, judge, and jury. And we begin with the lead House manager, Chairman Adam Schiff.
Oh, and I will, like I said, I will have a clip of Adam Schiff talking about Alan Dershowitz's claim that abuse of power isn't an impeachable offense, and that's pretty ridiculous. But where that clip of Alan Dershowitz comes from is from CNN's State of the Union. And this week, Jake Tapper was off. It was Breonna Keeler in. Breonna Keeler. And, if you look over my left shoulder, I have this Spock mug here. I'm, I don't know if I'm a Trekkie or a Trekker. I am able to tolerate either label for Star Trek fans. And whenever I hear the name Breonna Keeler, it makes me always think of Edith Keeler, who was one of the main characters in my favorite original Star Trek episode, City on the Edge of Forever. But that is neither here nor there, or maybe it is. Maybe that's how we got in this whole Trump timeline in the first place, was the Guardian of Forever, or the whatever. Anyway, that's how we ended up with the evil Biff as president. But Breonna Keeler does her State of the Union as Jake Tapper does every week. What is the State of the Union this week? It's bracing for a fight. And you'll see basically the same summary of the House impeachment managers coming over to the Senate, and then Trump's team, and then Alan Dershowitz at the very end. And I stopped it a little early because then Breonna Keeler introduces Jeffrey Toobin in a way that I will talk about after we watch this clip together over here.
I'm Breonna Keeler in for Jake Tapper in Washington, where the State of our Union is bracing for a fight. And we begin this morning with our first look at what the Senate trial of President Donald J. Trump will look like. Last night, the House impeachment managers filed a legal brief urging senators to consider their place in history and remove the president from office for conduct they called, quote, the framers' worst nightmare, arguing President Trump put his own political interests above the country's and poses a threat to national security. And for the first time, the president's legal team laid out their initial strategy, full of attacks on House Democrats, accusing them of, quote, a brazen and unlawful attempt to overturn the results of the 2016 election, and denying the charges in the articles of impeachment brought against the president, saying the president's dealings with Ukraine were, quote, perfectly legal and entirely appropriate. Joining me now, one of the attorneys who will speak on behalf of the president in the Senate trial, Alan Dershowitz. He's the author of the book, The Case Against Impeaching Trump, as well.
And I cut off that clip a little too early because she says, as well as Jeffrey Toobin. And I think she says CNN chief legal analyst and a former law student of Alan Dershowitz is at Harvard Law School. So that's a good setup for the clip I'm going to show you. Clip after next, clip number 6, after I show you the final news summary from Fox News Sunday. And you know, I was just talking about the loudest voice in the room over here and my 200 plus Fox News bias videos that I saw someone talking about in the live comments, how it's not an opinion, it's a fact, because I proved it with so many different videos. And I mean, there are multiple ways to prove media bias. I don't think, some people say if you show that a journalist has an opinion, that shows that they're biased. But no, you have to show that their opinion affects their work. And one way to show it is that they make these factual errors or show misleading one-sided facts, and it always favors one side. That's one of the things I did in my Fox News bias collection. Or they misstate facts and it always seems to favor one side. But another way you can do it is actually do reporting and get insider information on how they're the insiders all know that they're not really doing journalism. And that's what you find in Gabriel Sherman's book over here, The Loudest Voice in the Room, about Roger Ailes creating Fox News, among other things, after Nixon was forced to resign when he was going to be impeached, so that would never happen again. And it seems like they're fulfilling that prophecy right there. But the Fox News Sunday is one of the more straight news Fox News programs, but you can still see some bias in this reporting here. First, it starts off with Chris Wallace saying that, you know, it's mostly about process. You don't hear anything really about the facts in here. There's a new Fox News reporter who does most of the reporting, Mark Meredith. He talks about Davos, which we don't even know if they're going there. And then you'll see this whole question about the State of the Union that I think is a little bit biased, that I will talk about after we watch that 2.5-minute Fox News Sunday news summary, the final news summary, before we get to the newsmaker clips over here.
And hello again from Fox News in Washington. The Senate impeachment trial of President Trump is set to begin in just 2 days. But we still don't know exactly what the trial will look like, how long it will last, and whether senators will hear from witnesses. In a moment, we'll speak with Senator Lindsey Graham, a staunch supporter and confidant of the president. But first, let's bring in Mark Meredith with the latest from the president's Mar-a-Lago retreat in Florida. Mark.
Chris, President Trump is spending part of his weekend here in Florida, but he's scheduled to fly to Switzerland for an economic summit on Monday, only hours before the Senate starts its impeachment trial.
Do you solemnly swear?
Senators return to Washington Tuesday to begin battle over establishing rules governing President Trump's impeachment trial.
Our members feel that we have an obligation to listen to the arguments.
A fair trial seeks the truth. No more, no less.
Last night, the president's defense team, led by White House counsel Pat Cipollone and Trump attorney Jay Sekulow, responded to the Senate's impeachment summons, writing, quote, This is a brazen and unlawful attempt to overturn the results of the 2016 election and interfere with the 2020 election. The president's 8-member defense team includes some famous faces, among them former independent counsel Ken Starr and former Harvard law professor Alan Dershowitz, although Dershowitz insists he'll play a limited role. House Democrats have selected 7 members, led by House Intelligence Chair Adam Schiff, to be impeachment managers. On Saturday, Democrats sent the Senate a 111-page brief calling the evidence of abuse of power and obstruction of Congress overwhelming and the framers' quote, worst nightmare. But they argue more witnesses should still testify.
Let every senator reflect on that choice and let history weigh on every one of our shoulders.
For Democrats to get their way, they'll need to convince at least 4 Republican senators and all of their caucus to stand firm to force the Senate to hear new testimony. Republican leaders are pushing for a quick trial, possibly ending before the State of the Union, but no final timeline has been established. Chris?
Mark Meredith reporting from Mar-a-Lago. Mark, thank you. Joining us now from South Carolina.
And Lindsey Graham is joining him after that. And I will have a clip of Lindsey Graham, who actually gives more information about that last thing that Mark Meredith reported on, is the quick trial may be done before the State of the Union. And Lindsey Graham kind of gives away that he thinks it's going to be done before the State of the Union. And also talks about this plan maybe to, in the Clinton impeachment trial, they had each side got 24 hours of argument, not 24 hours in a row, but they split it up into like 5-hour segments. But apparently they're going to split it up into 2 12-hour segments, and that'll be the final clip that I show you, clip 10. But the other thing, the bias that I forgot to mention that was in Mark Meredith's report there, is he juxtaposed the two things that are supposedly contradictory in the House impeachment and now the House manager's argument that first that they have overwhelming evidence that Trump committed impeachable offenses, yet they still want to hear from more witnesses. And that's actually not as ridiculous as it sounds, given, like I said, all these breaking new developments and the absolute immunity defense where Trump has not turned over any witnesses or documents, not executive privilege where the witnesses go and testify, and then on certain questions that have to do with their conversations, their private conversations with the president, they might invoke executive privilege, but all sorts of other things they can testify about. That's not what Trump has done. He's invoked this thing called absolute immunity that nobody's ever heard of, that we don't have to send any people or any pieces of paper over to the Congress whatsoever. That is unprecedented, and that's why the second article of impeachment is for obstruction of Congress. Although I'm going to talk a lot more about the abuse of power count or article of impeachment, because as you saw in the NBC News Meet the Press news summary, when Alan Dershowitz was doing this Skype interview earlier this week, he said that abuse of power is not an impeachable offense, and that's something he's going to try to argue with Breonna Keeler and Jeffrey Toobin in this next clip. It's a little over 4 minutes long, but there's one part in the last minute that was so much of a stark contradiction by Alan Dershowitz that I actually uploaded it as a standalone video. If you were watching my channel earlier today, I uploaded it under the, what is wrong with Sandy over there? Sandy's whining about something. But I uploaded it under the title, Alan Dershowitz contradicts himself within 30 seconds on whether he said binding. And it's because he makes this argument in this next clip that the binding precedent on what is an impeachable, that impeachable offense has to be a crime, comes from Benjamin Curtis, this Supreme Court justice who argued for Andrew Johnson back in the Andrew Johnson impeachment in, was it 1868? I think it was 1868, if I have it was within a year or two of 1868. And I went back and read it, and he's right. Benjamin Curtis did argue that an impeachable offense had to be a crime, but pretty much everything else Alan Dershowitz says here is not true. Like that's the reason why the Senate decided not to remove him, that is highly arguable. And that's actually what's a removable offense, not what's an impeachable offense, because the House decides what's an impeachable offense. The Senate decides in the trial what's a removable offense. And House impeachment, basically, the big weight of authorities since 1868 have said an impeachable offense doesn't have to be a crime. And Jeffrey Toobin does a really bad job of cross-examining Alan Dershowitz on this, because he lets him sets up this straw man that, like, you're the only one who's ever said that an impeachable offense has to be a crime, and that's not true. It's just the huge weight of scholarly opinion is against that position, but that doesn't mean Alan Dershowitz is the only one, which is why Jeffrey Toobin does a bad job here. And Jeffrey Toobin also never picks up on the fact that within 30 seconds, Alan Dershowitz says that what Benjamin Curtis said back in 1868 or whatever was binding, and what the Senate did back then was binding. And then within 30 seconds, he says, oh, I never said binding, it's persuasive. Jeffrey Toobin missed that whole thing, though he did at least ask the question, and he did point out it's not binding, but I'll talk about all of that a little more after we watch that 4-minute Alan Dershowitz. Before I show this, I have to say that when I was in law school, I named my cat Dershowitz. One of the reasons I became a public defender was because of Alan Dershowitz's book, The Best Defense, and about how criminal defense attorneys are warriors for the Bill of Rights against a corrupt criminal justice system, and how far he has fallen in my eyes. I don't know. They say some people when they get old they get conservative. He claims to be a liberal Democrat multiple times in the 2 interviews he did on CNN and ABC today, but I am so sad to see where Dershowitz has ended up, because I was a Dershowitz fan years ago, and for many years now I have not been a Dershowitz fan, and I will continue. I will explain additional reasons I'm not a Dershowitz fan after we watch this 4 minutes or so of his back and forth with Breonna Keeler and Jeffrey Toobin on CNN's State of the Union about whether abuse of power is an impeachable offense over here.
I'm going to make this on the floor of the Senate too, and that is, there is a confusion between the reasons for having impeachment, and those include we don't want to see presidents who are dishonest, we don't want to see presidents who abuse their power. That's all true. But then when it comes to coming up with the criteria for impeachment, we don't use terms like dishonesty or abuse or maladministration or malpractice. We have to focus in on specific criteria to avoid weaponization of impeachment. So there's an enormous difference between the reasons we have impeachment on the one hand and the criteria for impeachment.
So
are you saying
that it's not necessarily? Are you saying that it's not necessarily that what the president did was not wrong or rising to a certain level? It's actually just that House Democrats mislabeled it, that they've labeled it in a way that could make this weaponized because it's too general or it's not fitting the criteria that you think it should?
Well, not that I think it should, that the Constitution thinks it should, that Justice Curtis thinks it should, and that the framers of the Constitution think it should. The reason that they came up with abuse of power and obstruction
and there's debate
of
on that, I should say.
Is that, yeah, and the reason they came up with those is they could not honestly get a majority to charge bribery, treason, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So they went back to obstruction and to abuse, and those do not fit the constitutional criteria.
Alan,
that's the argument I'll make.
Alan,
I think it's important for that argument to be heard by the Senate. Let the senators decide whether my view prevails or the views of others are better.
Of course, the House said that these were high crimes and misdemeanors. And I think it's important that everyone know that the argument you're making, that the president has to commit, in a sense, a criminal offense, a violation of commit a crime in order to be impeached, has never been adopted.
That's what Curtis said.
Well, that may be
yes,
what,
it has
what
been.
Curtis
no, you're
said.
just dead
Alan,
wrong.
in
That's what Curtis said.
1974, the House Committee, the Judiciary Committee wrote an entire report saying there was no reason that impeachable offenses do not have to be crimes.
That's a committee report. You said it was never adopted. The Senate refused to remove Andrew Johnson because Justice Curtis successfully argued that you need a crime. Without a crime, there can be no impeachment. That's what Curtis argued. That's what the Senate concluded. That is the only governing precedent that we have for an actual trial in the Senate. You can argue all you want about what the committee put into a report. That's not binding. What's binding is what the Senate did, what the actual outcome of the case was, what Curtis argued, who was the most distinguished constitutional scholar of his day, the dissenter
Jeffrey,
in Dred Scott, and you're dismissing that.
Jeff, the idea that the argument made by one lawyer in 1868 is somehow binding on senators, 200 years, almost 150 years later.
Persuasive,
but
not binding, but persuasive.
Every scholar except you has looked at this issue about whether it has to be a crime in order to be an impeachable offense, has said no. Whether it's looking at Alexander Hamilton in 1860 in Federal 65. I mean, come on.
I want to interject here. I want to interject.
The Harvard Law Review had an article in 2018, which took the Curtis view and took my view. Others have taken the Curtis view and my view. Look,
Gentlemen,
it's important for the Senate to hear all these views. Let them hear and decide.
And they will hear and decide. They will hear and decide. And Alan, I have an important question that I want to ask you about. This is more about from a public opinion standpoint. You are on the defense team. Ken Starr is on the defense team. You both represented some controversial figures, among them.
That's our job.
That's right. Jeffrey Epstein. The two of you were integral in.
And like I said earlier, I actually agree with Dershowitz, Alan Dershowitz there, when he says that's our job for defending controversial people. Sometimes despicable people have to be defended in order to vindicate the constitutional rights under the Sixth Amendment to have an attorney, to have a fair trial, all the Bill of Rights to confront your accusers, due process, all of that. That requires lawyers to represent people who may not be very nice people, and that's the way our system works. But pretty much everything else Alan Dershowitz said before that was not quite as cogent or as persuasive. And well, he said, you saw in there that he when you're a lawyer, there are two kinds. There are binding precedents that a court has to follow, and then there are things that aren't binding precedent that you can show to the court that might be persuasive. Those are two different categories that every lawyer knows very clearly. And if you watched about a minute or so from the end of that clip, Alan Dershowitz definitely said that what Benjamin Curtis argued and the Senate decided back in 1868 was binding precedent. And then when Jeffrey Toobin called him on it, he definitely said, oh, I never said binding. I said persuasive, not binding. And if you watched my 45-second video that I uploaded earlier today showing Alan Dershowitz contradicting himself within 30 seconds, and you were wondering, well, was that clip taken out of context? Well, there you have the 4-minute context, and the answer is no, not taken out of context. He definitely contradicted himself. And what is wrong with Alan Dershowitz that he would contradict himself that way, that he would make this argument? I wanted to talk about Federalist 65. Here's a screenshot of Federalist 65. There's a link down to the entire Federalist 65 in the video description. But if you look at the sentence there that I've highlighted, they're talking about the Senate trying impeachments and what's the jurisdiction there. And they say, well, the subjects of its jurisdiction are those offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men, or in other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. Abuse or violation of some public trust. abuse of the public trust, that is abuse of power. The word high in high crimes and misdemeanors, if you watch the constitutional scholars who testified to the House Judiciary Committee, the word high means coming from a high office. And that's one thing you have to understand about impeachment. Why not everything that is impeachable is a crime? Because there are certain things that only the commander-in-chief can do. Like one thing that Alan Dershowitz argued wouldn't be impeachable is if Trump said to Vladimir Putin, "Oh, you can retake Alaska and I won't object." What if Trump ordered the U.S. military not to defend Alaska? Well, that's not going to be a crime, because there's not going to be a crime to order the military not to defend American citizens, because there's only one person who's commander-in-chief, and we don't write our criminal laws to criminalize behavior by the President of the United States, well, except in the case of Andrew Johnson. And I don't want to get into all the Andrew Johnson history, but that was the other thing Dershowitz said that makes no sense, that's the reason that the Senate voted not to remove Andrew Johnson, is because he wasn't charged with a crime, that his impeachable offenses weren't crimes. That's not the reason. That's what the former justice of the Supreme Court argued, that but it's not the reason he wasn't removed. And so, anyway, that is the ridiculousness of Dershowitz's argument. And I want to move on now to Dick Durbin, who I don't think does that great a job of refuting what Alan Dershowitz said, but he does actually refer to Federalist 65. So at least there's that. And like I said, down in the video description, I put a link on the Yale University website to Federalist 65. You can read the whole thing for yourself. It also talks about the danger of partisan impeachments being decided more on the split in the legislature between the partisan factions, rather than on the facts about guilt and innocence. But I think that actually cuts against the Republicans, because they're the ones, the reason this has been a partisan impeachment, you can decide for yourself, but in my opinion, it's not because the Democrats have gone forward with evidence that's not strong enough. It's because the Republicans are like covering their eyes and their ears, and I see nothing, I know nothing. That was something that I saw one of the pundits say on one of the shows earlier today, the Sergeant Schultz defense from Hogan's Heroes. I see nothing, I know nothing. That's sort of the Republican response to the impeachable offenses of Donald Trump. But anyway, here's Dick Durbin mentioning Federalist 65, although not giving the best refutation of Alan Dershowitz, over in a clip I'll talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
Let me get you to respond to something from the president's legal team. It wasn't their official briefing, it was more of just their official response. So more of a statement than a legal document right now, but this is what they write. House Democrats' abuse of power claim would do lasting damage to the separation of powers under the Constitution. The essential argument they're making is that this is very subjective. It's a partisan decision that was made in the House. It's not a bipartisan decision. And abuse of power it isn't defined anywhere in law. So how do you respond to that critique?
I just asked those who criticize it to take a look at Federalist 65. Alexander Hamilton, not the musical, the real Alexander Hamilton, actually spoke out about what this trial gets down to. They were saying at the beginning that the standards are treason, bribery, high crimes, and misdemeanors. And it goes beyond the commission of a crime. Alan Dershowitz takes a very unique position, saying a crime must have been committed. But when it comes to the abuse of power of the office, if the president misused the office for personal political gain, that to me is in the realm of what they considered in high crimes and misdemeanors and the abuse of power.
The accusations and the documents that Lev Parnas, the Giuliani associate, that...
Oh, and you see there Chuck Todd asking about Lev Parnas, like you saw Lev Parnas covered in the NBC News Meet the Press news summary. So kudos to Meet the Press for talking about the continuing additional evidence about Trump's abuse of power in the Ukraine scandal. And I think Dick Durbin at least referenced Federalist 65, and like I said, the abuse or violation of some public trust, which is basically abuse of power, as one of the main reasons that they put impeachment, one of the main subject matter jurisdictions for an impeachment trial in the Senate, according to Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 65 there. But I want to show another clip disabusing Alan Dershowitz of his poor scholarship on this matter. This is Representative Adam Schiff talking to George Stephanopoulos on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos this morning. First, George Stephanopoulos has Adam Schiff respond to the 6-page filing from the Trump administration in response to, what was it, 170-something page filing, the trial memo from the House impeachment managers that I put down in the video description, the trial memo that they filed on Saturday that got like a 6-page response. And you'll see Adam Schiff says there's nothing really new from Trump. But then he also responds to this Dershowitz claim that abuse of power isn't an impeachable offense at the end of the clip that I will talk about with you after we watch together over here.
I want to start with the president's first official filing. The quotes from there: a categorical denial of each and every allegation, calling it the fruit of a lawless process and a dangerous attack on our elections. You've now had the chance to review it. What's your response?
Well, it's surprising in that it really doesn't offer much new beyond the failed arguments we heard in the House. The facts aren't seriously contested. The president withheld hundreds of millions of dollars of military aid to an ally at war with Russia, withheld a White House meeting that the president of Ukraine desperately sought to establish with his country and with his adversary, the support of the United States, in order to coerce Ukraine into helping him cheat in the next election. They really can't contest those facts. And the only thing really new about the president's defense is that they're now arguing, I think because they can't contest the facts, that the president cannot be impeached for abusing the power of his office.
That's what I wanted to get to, because that's the argument. Alan Dershowitz is coming up, and that's the argument he's going to make. He says, quote, abuse of power, even if proved, is not an impeachable offense.
Well, that's the argument I suppose you have to make if the facts are so dead set against you. If the president has admitted to the wrongdoing, his chief of staff has confessed to the wrongdoing, his European Union ambassador has confessed to the same quid pro quo, you have to rely on an argument that even if he abused his office in this horrendous way, that it's not impeachable. You had to go so far out of the mainstream to find someone to make that argument. You had to leave the realm of constitutional law scholars and go to criminal defense lawyers. Even Professor Turley, who testified on behalf of House Republicans, couldn't make that argument. In fact, in the House made exactly the opposite argument, that abuse of power is at the center of what the framers intended an impeachable offense to be. The logic of that absurdist position that's being now adopted by the president is he could give away the state of Alaska. He could withhold execution of sanctions on Russia for interfering in the last election to induce or coerce Russia to interfere in the next one. That would have appalled, the mere idea of this would have appalled the founders who were worried about exactly that kind of solicitation of foreign interference in an election for a personal benefit, the danger it poses to national security. That goes to the very heart of what the framers intended to be impeachable.
Let's talk about Lev Parnas. You released...
Oh, and you see there, I kept that clip going a little bit so that at the end there, so you could see ABC News' This Week with George Stephanopoulos. Also did mention the Lev Parnas breaking news. I mean, it was mentioned on most of the news shows, just NBC News' Meet the Press was the only one that put it in the news summary right at the beginning of the show. I don't know if that means more people got to see it on NBC because, I don't know, people fall asleep during the show or turn to football, or I don't know what their viewer retention rates look like. But generally, if you put something at the beginning of the show, people are more likely to see it, I guess. But at least that's the rule on YouTube, but I assume that's the rule everywhere in the universe. But you can let me know what you think down in the comments section. And before I get to the final news clip, before the bonus Dash and Sandy clip, which has some scandalous allegations about Ken Starr and Alan Dershowitz as audio in the background of my Dash and Sandy clip. Can you believe that? But this next news clip before the final Lindsey Graham news clip is Jerry Nadler talking to Margaret Brennan on CBS News's Face the Nation, where he responds to the naming of Ken Starr, the Clinton overzealous independent counsel who went after Bill Clinton for a affair that he had in the Oval Office that was definitely the height of impeachment overreach. And now he is defending Donald Trump, the most impeachable president since Andrew Johnson, who was almost removed but lost by like one vote, not because abuse of power isn't a crime or not because he wasn't impeached for a crime. That is not why Andrew Johnson wasn't removed, despite what you heard from Alan Dershowitz earlier. But anyway, here's Jerry Nadler. This is actually almost a comedy clip because this is one of those clips where the person says no comment and then actually gives complete comment. No comment, no, actually complete comment. So Margaret Brennan asks, will you comment on the, Jerry Nadler, will you comment on the naming of Alan Dershowitz and Ken Starr as members of Trump's defense team for impeachment, for the impeachment trial in the Senate? And Jerry Nadler says he doesn't want to comment, and then he gives a complete comment, which I will talk about after we watch that clip together over here.
But I want to ask you about the president's legal team, or at least some lawyers who are going to be speaking on behalf of the president, Alan Dershowitz among them. Ken Starr also added as someone who's going to be speaking before the Senate. What do you think of their additions to the team? What does that suggest to you as someone who will be prosecuting?
I'm not going to comment on their witnesses, except that Ken Starr apparently thinks that asking a foreign government to involve itself in our elections is okay, but the president 20 years ago talking about a private sexual affair, that's impeachable. I mean, it's ridiculous.
And Alan Dershowitz says it's not a constitutional criteria for impeachment, abuse of power. It doesn't meet that standard.
Well, I was surprised to see Alan Dershowitz say that. That's simply ignorance. If you read all the history of impeachments in the country, if you read the Federalist Papers, if you read the Constitutional Convention debates from the 1780s, if you read the Majority Staff Report of the House Judiciary Committee in 1974, there's no question about that. Yeah. It's ridiculous.
Okay. All right. Chairman, we'll be watching. Thank you very much for your time this morning. We now go to a senator who...
So what do you think? Wasn't that a no comment, then total comment? No comment, but then total comment on the appointment of Ken Starr and Alan Dershowitz to Trump's legal defense team for the impeachment trial. I think I pretty much criticized that clip before I showed it, but the final clip I want to show is from Fox News Sunday, Chris Wallace interviewing Lindsey Graham, one of the strongest defenders of Donald Trump, and also a Clinton impeachment manager. He was in the House at the time, so he came over from the House and prosecuted Bill Clinton, said there have to be witnesses, was all for going after the President of the United States for lying about having a sexual affair with a intern in the Oval Office, among other places, I guess. If you read the whole Starr report, which I happen to have done many, many years ago, and like I said, Ken Starr was total prosecutorial overreach, and the flip-flops from the Republicans. I mean, some Democrats have done some flip-flops, I guess, but the thing is, the facts are so different. The facts were so, in terms of abuse of office, the power of the presidency to cover, like, you don't have to be president to cover up an affair. I mean, what Bill Clinton did was nasty, was sexual harassment, probably, since he was president of the United States. And I mean, if you, whatever, I don't want to go into the whole Monica Lewinsky affair and all of that, and but it wasn't an abuse of the power of the office. I mean, there were some abuses in terms of smearing Monica Lewinsky, but compared to what Trump does every day in terms of smearing people like Marie Yovanovitch or Lieutenant Colonel Vindman or James Comey, who, you know, I'm not a big fan of James Comey, but I mean, so many people. Anyway, that now I'm going off on a tangent, but I want to get to Lindsey Graham being asked a question by Chris Wallace here about the rush to judgment. And this is kind of revealing because Fox News, in the news summary I showed earlier, talked about how they may rush this through to get it done before the State of the Union on February 4th. And this idea that the Democrats have not seen what the Republican proposed rules in the Senate are going to be, but apparently McConnell's going to give each side 2 12-hour days, 2 12-hour days from 1 p.m. to 1 a.m. On Tuesday and Wednesday for the prosecution, and then Thursday and Friday for the defense, I guess. 1 p.m. to 1 a.m. And that is like not a real trial just in terms of the hours. It's ridiculous. As a former trial lawyer, I don't think you can get a jury to pay attention for that long, whether it's the jury of the Senate or the jury of the American public. And while Lindsey Graham doesn't really answer the question from Chris Wallace about that, and he dodges it by talking about whether Nancy Pelosi is religious and who she's praying for and raising holy hell. In the follow-up question where Chris Wallace mentions Lindsey Graham being really close to Donald Trump and, you know, what's Trump thinking, Lindsey Graham in his second answer actually says he thinks it's going to all be done before the State of the Union, which is the final news clip that I will talk about with you after we watch it together over here.
Let me just say one thing. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I just got 2 more quick questions to ask you, and we'll try to get through this as quickly as possible. You talk about wanting to get through this, the trial as quickly as possible. There are reports that Republican Senate Leader McConnell is going to put out a rule on Tuesday that for the opening arguments, 24 hours for each side, he's prepared to put the Senate in session 12 hours a day. So basically, the House prosecutors would get 2 12-hour days, and the defense would get 2 12-hour days to make their opening arguments. 1, is that true? And 2, if it is, how do you respond to the Democratic impeachment managers who say this is just a rush to get this over with?
Well, to my friends on the Democratic side, you know, I like Nancy Pelosi. I've known her for years, and I think she is a very religious person. But when it comes to Donald Trump, Nancy Pelosi may pray for him privately, but she's orchestrated the Church of Holy Hell. From the time Trump has been sworn in to now, it's been one thing after another. Here's what I'd say to the House folks. You took 48 days to impeach this president. You did not allow him to call any witnesses. He could not have a lawyer present during the House Intel Committee. This has been a partisan railroad job, and you're asking for fairness in Senate. You violated every norm of what we do. It took 5 years for Starr to look at Clinton. Mueller looked at Trump for almost 2 years, and you took 48 days. So here's what I would say. The sooner this is over, the better for the country. We can get back to do the business of the American people and do things that really matter to them. I've been very consistent. I supported Mueller. I trusted him to be fair. This has been a political hit job. This is political revenge. And what they're doing to the presidency is a danger to the institution itself.
And finally, in 30 seconds, I think it's fair to say that you are the senator who is personally closest to President Trump, and at various points you've said that he's mad as hell, he's demanding his day in court. I assume you've spoken to him recently. What's his mood? How does he feel about the fact that he's about to undergo a trial for removal in the Senate, and what does he want from the Senate?
I think he wants to have a chance to have his day in court that he did get in the House. It'd be nice to have a lawyer present. It'd be nice to request witnesses. I guarantee you, he'll get a better deal in the House than Senate did in the House. But his mood is to go to the State of the Union with this behind him and talk about what he wants to do for the next rest of 2020 and what he wants to do for the next 4 years. He is very much comfortable with the idea this is going to turn out well for him. He believes politically this has helped him. He thinks it's a threat to the presidency. The one thing he talks to me constantly about is what does the next president do after this if this is successful? He does not want to legitimize attack on the presidency, and that's my #1 goal, is to do this trial in a fashion that no House, Republican or Democrat, ever again will do what this House did.
Senator Graham, thank you. Thanks for joining us. Always good to talk with you.
Now, if Lindsey Graham was really worried about lowering the bar for impeachment, he wouldn't have been so gung-ho for impeachment of Bill Clinton, who engaged in some bad personal behavior that probably didn't rise to the level of abuse of office, didn't rise to the level that you can see in Federalist 65 here, that talks about the subject matter for an impeachment trial being those offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men, or in other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. So abuse of power, abuse of a public office, using public power for personal gain, not the public good. That's exactly what happened in this whole Ukraine scandal. And for Lindsey Graham to, and Ken Starr and Lindsey Graham get like the hypocrite of the multiple centuries, because they span from the 20th to the 21st. It's like the I don't know, is Lindsey Graham bi? Well, Lindsey Graham is a bi-millennial hypocrite. I don't know, I'm not saying anything, not making any sort of sexual innuendos about Lindsey Graham. I'm just saying he's a bi-millennial hypocrite. Just like Ken Starr switching from defending or from prosecuting Bill Clinton to defending Donald Trump, the weakest impeachment to the strongest impeachment in terms of abuse of power and violation of the public trust. They are just the biggest bi-millennial hypocrites of the millennium, the millennia of human history, I guess. Is that an award? I guess it's an award I just created. But anyway, I appreciate all of you who joined me for my Sunday live clip roundup. I especially appreciate Lulu Girl for giving me super chat contributions. I think that so far those were the only super chat contributions I saw here. Last week my video was demonetized, and then I appealed it, and it was still demonetized after I appealed it. I think because I talked about Iran and the downing of the Ukrainian airliner by Iran, and that's like too violent. And even though all I do is talk about like what the corporate news media talked about in their flagship news analysis programs every Sunday morning, I mean, that's the heart of the corporate news media, and that's all advertising based, but my commentary on it is somehow not suitable for advertisers. Last week and even this week I've appealed the demonetization of this video. I don't know how that's going to turn out, but that's why I appreciate my super chat contributors like Lulu Girl there. You can also become a channel member by pressing that join button below my video, or there are links down in the video description to become a monthly patron or give a direct PayPal contribution at the $5 contribution level. I give you this hashtag LiberalViewer weatherproof vinyl sticker. At the $10 level, I send you this ACLU Constitution, Pocket Constitution, and the sticker. Oh, I'm not getting light on this, so you can see it there. And then I'm about to print new t-shirts, but I won't go into that. But before I finish, I did promise a bonus Dash and Sandy clip. This Dash and Sandy clip occurred while I was watching the MSNBC program KCDC. Casey Hunt, she just came back last week after a long maternity leave, and I often watch that program to see if there's any breaking news before, because it's just a few hours before I actually broadcast my program. And in this Dash and Sandy clip in the background, you're going to hear audio of Frank Figliuzzi, this former FBI agent who is a commentator on MSNBC, saying things that they're like really salacious accusations against Alan Dershowitz and Ken Starr, but I didn't even really want to cover these, but they ended up, the audio was in the background of my bonus Dash and Sandy clip, and this is kind of a smear also, and I kind of apologize for that, but it just goes to show you, even on MSNBC, they have former cops doing what cops do, which is smear people with innuendo, which you will hear in the background of this bonus Dash and Sandy clip I end the program with over here.
Defense, right? These are personalities, and if you start scratching not too deeply on Starr and Dershowitz, as you all have said, you're going to find some pretty creepy things about both of them, including allegations of underage sex, and Dershowitz writing an op-ed back in the 90s in the LA Times where he says, the age of consent could be possibly 14. We're all getting blown out of shape on statutory rape. And then you've got Starr, who was literally walked out of Baylor University by his board because he was looking the other way while the football team was doing horrible things with co-eds.
Well, actually, what he said about Ken Starr, that's true, that he was president of Baylor and then got kicked out for not taking seriously rape allegations. And but that whole thing about Dershowitz, well, there are some weird things about Dershowitz going on Jeffrey Epstein's plane and going to, some people call it Rape Island or Pedophile Island, somewhere off of one of the Virgin Island, was it near St. Thomas or one of the, I don't know all the facts, so I hesitate to smear people with innuendo when I don't know all the facts. But it's not just that Dershowitz represented Jeffrey Epstein, he did engage in some weird activity involving Jeffrey Epstein, but is it worth talking about, or anyway, that it's weird it got caught in the background of a Dash and Sandy clip, but that's what happened. And anyway, I appreciate all of you who joined me for the live program. My recorded show viewers, please let me know what you think of the broadcast, especially if you made it all the way to the end here and watched the whole thing. Give me a thumbs up, subscribe to my channel, give me a positive, supportive comment, and I will be back next week and every week for the, well, at least for the rest of 2020, I guess. And maybe I'll have some reason to upload another edited, produced video, which I sort of did today on that Dershowitz self-contradiction. It was a very brief, easy to produce video, and anyway, until I do something like that or more extensive, or until next Sunday and every Sunday for the rest of the year, I guess I will be seeing all of you around the internet.